Good afternoon and welcome to this session of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This afternoon, we will focus on a new book by University of Cambridge historian Mira Siegelberg, Statelessness, A Modern History. Dr. Siegelberg, congratulations and welcome to the Washington History Seminar. We're also very fortunate to have with us as commentator and to get the discussion of the book going, Emory University professor Mary Dujak joining us. A warm welcome to you as well, Mary. I'm Christian Osterman. I direct the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program. Delighted to be co-chairing, as almost always, this seminar with Eric Arneson of George Washington University. And Eric, of course, is the director of the National History Center. Eric will today introduce the speakers and moderate the discussion. As many of you of our regular viewers know, the Washington History Seminar is a collaborative, now decade-long effort of two organizations, the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program and the National History Center of the American Historical Association. Prior to the pandemic, we met on a weekly basis at the Wilson Center, but since July, we've now been very pleased to come to you via Zoom and Facebook. Behind the scenes, there are two individuals who helped produce this event, Rachel Wheatley of the National History Center and Peter Bierstecker on the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program. We thank our institutional supporters, the LePage Center for History and the Public Interest, and George Washington University's History Department. Thank them for their financial support. We're also grateful to a number of individual donors who make these meetings possible and whose rank we encourage you to join. Details about how to do so are available in the chat room right now, or simply go to our institutional websites. A quick explanation of the proceedings. Our session today will be recorded and will soon appear on our respective organizations' websites. For the Q&A part of the seminar, which Eric will moderate, please use the raise hand function in the Zoom functionality if you would like to ask a question, or use the Q&A function to post your question. Once you press the button, you will be entered into a queue. And when the moderator calls on you, you will receive a prompt to unmute yourself. Please press yes, and you will be able to talk. You may also submit questions to Rachel Wheatley via the email rwheatley, rwheatley @historians.org. And with that, I'll turn the Zoom room over to Eric. Eric.
Thank you, Christian. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker this afternoon. Mira L. Siegelberg is University Lecturer in the History of International Political Thought at Cambridge University. She received her BA from Columbia and a PhD in history from Harvard University in 2014, after which she held a postdoctoral fellowship at the Princeton Society of Fellows and a permanent lectureship in history and law at Queen Mary University of London. Her research focuses on the intellectual and legal history of the international order and the history of modern legal thought. Her articles have appeared in Modern Intellectual History, Humanity, and the Journal of Genocide Studies. And today, she will be speaking on her new book, Statelessness, A Modern History, which was published by Harvard University Press in October. Mira, the Zoom room is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Eric, for that introduction, to Rachel and Peter for organizing, and to Christian, Mary, and Eric for being here to talk to me about the book today. And I suppose everyone who is somewhere out there. So let me just step back first and just acknowledge that the term statelessness, which is of course front and center in the book's title, is quite an evocative and expansive term. It can bring to mind people without a state or without a homeland, and in more emotive language, it might bring to mind the estimated 70 million people who are currently forcibly displaced around the world, And I think it also automatically generates thoughts and questions about the state itself, its nature, its future, and the boundaries of its responsibilities. But to say that someone is a stateless person also has a very particular legal meaning. It's a status that's defined in two international agreements created after the Second World War, and it implies that a person who does not have a national status in any country, or a form of membership that shows up through passports or other identifying documents. In international law, to be categorized as a stateless person is different from being defined as a refugee, which is a separate identification that's defined most prominently in the 1951 Refugee Convention. Now, both of these legal frameworks that define the status of the refugee and the stateless person, at least theoretically, establish exceptions to the general expectation or rule that states have absolute control over who their members are and who gets to cross their borders. Until quite recently, the international institutions that were established after World War II to manage and care for uprooted people tended to treat legal statelessness as a rather marginal issue within the wider framework of international refugee oversight. Though the legal stateless, in the sense defined by these conventions, have more recently become the object of increasing attention from the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, from legal scholars and activists and political theorists, the longstanding neglect of people who fall into this category has become a subject of theoretical interest in its own right. So in the book, I try to explain how and why the loss of nationality became so marginal, or came to seem so marginal in the first place. How did statelessness come to be codified in the way that it did after the Second World War? And what does the history of critical reflection on the problem of statelessness in the 20th century tell us about the origins of the international order that has shaped the governing legal frameworks that set the boundary between citizenship and non-citizenship? Now, these questions seemed particularly urgent to me when I started the project in light of revised historiographical perspectives on the history of imperial and international order. The fact that historians had begun to appreciate that the global norm of citizenship and the national state as the sole post-imperial claimant to international legitimacy suddenly seemed much more recent than previously supposed. In the book, I'm proposing that the history of how concepts of non-citizenship were codified internationally provides unique insight into how expectations about the legitimate boundaries of political and international political life were forged in the first place in this much more recent era. So just by way of comparison to my own approach and perspective, the historian Eric Hobsbawm describes statelessness as a novel concept in the 20th century that was symptomatic of the age of extremes, which is his phrase for the 20th century, when a new kind of vulnerability emerged with the collapse of multi-ethnic empires during World War I, the rise of more exclusive forms of citizenship, and the emergence of new extreme political ideologies. And then, according to this narrative, the legal frameworks were established as a way to try to mitigate these new harsh realities and were a rather marginal part of the broader international history of the 20th century. But while it's true that national or legal membership assumed a new significance during the First World War, when borders closed down, passports became a requirement, and statelessness became a new category that described vast numbers of people without citizenship, it's also true that when the stateless became a significant feature of international politics, most of the world's people were living under some kind of imperial rule. And by the end of the war, the contours of international order, what a state is, who gets to claim one, how membership in a state is determined, as well as the future of imperial rule and international authority, were all the objects of political struggle and were being worked out politically, institutionally, and militarily. So the book pivots around two main moments in the creation of international order: the period following the First World War, and then after the Second World War, when the legal frameworks that I mentioned took shape. So two parallel but also linked stories run throughout the book. The first is about the eventual stabilization of the conceptual boundaries of states, what counts as inside and what counts as outside, and what the creation of these legal categories reveal about the ideological foundations of this process. The second is about how belonging is defined in international legal terms, but also what legal means in this context, and why the history of legal thought is so important if we want to grapple with this question. Nationality, after all, has been defined as the formal or legal side of citizenship. It's often described as the legal bond between individuals and governments. But what does it actually mean to say that this bond is legal in nature? Until the end of World War I, international legal theory had generally portrayed individuals without a national status, meaning a formal connection to a state, as impossibilities in a world organized around centralized governments. Such people, of course, existed and were the object of some interest for legal theorists and international lawyers. But the premise of legal and political reasoning around nationality was that everyone must have a national status somewhere, even if this was really a fiction that underwrote a particular vision of international order. But after the First World War, national courts begin to validate the idea that a person could have no nationality, could be stateless, based on the idea that since it's within the sovereign power of each state to determine its membership, foreign courts can't challenge how other states set the terms of how national status is gained or lost, which, by the way, represented a fascinating marked shift from an earlier legal presumption and also from diplomatic practice. The recognition of no nationality as a legal status by national courts then proved rather revolutionary in the years that followed the Versailles peace settlement. As opposed to the idea that a stateless person was seen as a legal anomaly until the creation of the human rights instruments created after World War II, the entry of statelessness into international life began to inspire concrete reflection on law and rights beyond the state in a period when the future of empire and nation, sovereignty, and international law all appeared very much in question. The recognition of statelessness and the possibility that stateless persons could have legal standing before the courts had profound implications for themes and subjects that had been at the heart of international legal thought, as well as theories of the state. Who are the subjects of international law, and what does it mean to have legal standing in the absence of a national status? Who, in other words, are the agents that can act on the stage of international politics? Now, these debates that I reconstruct in the book are also taking shape against the backdrop of new international organizations like the League of Nations and international and new humanitarian movements that were established to provide relief for the suffering and the dispossessed after World War I. And these organizations are also trying to restore order after the breakdown of the war and then revolution. In the book, I focus particularly on the Viennese legal theorist Hans Kelsen and his students, as well as on refugee legal scholars from the former Russian Empire, all of whom were thinking and arguing in sophisticated and complex ways in interwar Europe about the conceptual and political possibilities of post-imperial legal identification and citizenship, but were also engaging directly and practically with novel international agencies and post-imperial national polities. So the particular intellectual and political significance of the problem of statelessness in this period becomes clear not just by looking at the systematic writings, the kind of fodder for intellectual history that discuss the significance of this phenomenon, but also at the archives of the League and other international organizations, and as well as national archives that were involved in the legal identification and governance of populations excluded from new political orders. Now, from the perspective of League officials, acknowledging statelessness as a general phenomenon threatened the fragile boundaries between international and national spheres of authority that the institution was trying to institutionalize in the name of stabilizing international and inter-imperial order after the war. While minorities and the subjects of the mandatory powers, so some of the new international legal subjects created by the Versailles peace treaties, were accorded some legal rights to represent themselves, the stateless represented the possibility of individuals bearing an independent legal status in international law, at least in accordance with the doctrinal theory on the subject. And it was precisely because it carried this connotation that League officials reframed the problem in less threatening terms. So writing this history has meant studying international political thought and international history in a very particular way. It's meant bringing international legal sources and the sources of international history really into the same frame as the more canonical figures in the history of political and legal thought. So figures like Hannah Arendt, perhaps the most famous political writer to discuss the problem of statelessness, but also the jurist Hans Kelsen and Hirsch Lauterpacht, the theorist of international law and human rights. And it means that it's necessary to study their systematic and critical reflections together with the more traditional archives of international and diplomatic history. But the main reason that I tried to understand why the problem of statelessness was seen to connect so profoundly to debates about the nature of politics and law, rights and sovereignty, international law and personhood in the interwar period, and to explore the particular legal and political consciousness that underwrote these debates, was ultimately to try to understand how and why that changed, why statelessness ultimately became so marginal in the post-war decades, not just within the international agencies that were set up to define and provide relief for refugees and stateless persons, but also within international political and legal thought generally. I also became interested in why the morally richer ways, or the seemingly morally richer ways of appreciating the plight of statelessness that we find articulated in the post-World War II period, why it's a problem to not have a nationality in a world that's fully organized into particular sovereign countries. How this shift also contributed to its marginalization as a problem fundamentally related to international order itself, and to the basic challenge of how we as human beings organize ourselves collectively, and how we deal with phenomena that are intrinsically collective in nature. Now, I don't want to suggest that the problem of statelessness in the interwar period wasn't seen as morally urgent by the legal theorists who appear in the book, but that they originally saw an intimate connection between the major theoretical debates animating political and legal thought about what law is and how it relates to political and social reality, and the emergent political realities of statelessness in a context of dynamic state formation. So the question explored really in the second half of the book is how these more fundamental debates about the boundaries of politics that were attached to the problem of statelessness came to be eventually stabilized and neutralized in the post-World War II legal frameworks, how they serve to cover over or bracket an intrinsically collective phenomenon that is in some ways intrinsically bound up with the problems of the foundations of politics and political order, how membership and political boundaries are established in the first place. In the UN, in the late 1940s and early 1950s, where legal scholars and international civil servants and representatives from member nations discussed the creation of international agreements to outline the obligations of signatory states, the loss of nationality was often defined as illegible or indeterminate from a moral standpoint. And though these are the deliberations that led to the conventions that define what it means to be stateless in international legal terms, the distinctions that were developed to define the stateless, to separate the concept from that of the refugee, were shaped by an emphasis placed on the substance of citizenship and on the social and psychological experience of being a stateless person, rather than on the protection afforded by bearing a formal legal connection to a state. Unearthing these key conceptual and argumentative terms in which the frameworks were established, again meant reading the politics of the post-war era in the context of more theoretical discussions about the nature of law, and in particular, how formalist conceptions of law and legal order gave way generally in this period to more pragmatic understandings of what law is and how it connects to political reality. Though nationality is still defined as the formal or legal side of citizenship, in the 1950s, the international legal concept of nationality began to imply an identification rooted in socially significant relationships and practices rather than being a more formal legal designation. Now, the appeal to social reality after World War II in turn served an important ideological role in the consolidation of national boundaries, in part through the way that post-colonial governments formed out of empires. And so one of the things that I'm trying to show is that how the arguments that justify the presumption that the boundaries of membership should be compatible with sociological and historical reality, how these arguments contributed to the naturalization of the boundaries of international political order and international politics itself. Just as a quick example, in the early 1960s, British colonial officials rejected proposals to relabel former imperial subjects who were excluded from national citizenship by some post-colonial governments as UK nationals. And they argued that such a category was just an empty legal form, a legal fiction that didn't reflect social reality. Now, the specificity of the intellectual world in which interwar arguments about the meaning of statelessness for international order, the specificity cannot be underestimated. But what I ultimately want to suggest is that the way theorists of statelessness connected nationality and its absence to more fundamental questions about the boundaries of politics means that these debates are, I think, a critical resource at the present moment. I don't think there are ready institutional solutions that can be borrowed from the past, although we can talk about this. Looking ahead to current and future crises, I mean, just thinking of one, climate migration, I think we are going to need to connect the questions of citizenship and non-citizenship to the fundamental issues of politics and political order. But in order to do so, we also have to understand how such issues were at least temporarily settled and bracketed in the first place. So I'll leave it there, and I'm greatly looking forward to hearing from Mary and everyone else.
Thank you so much. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our discussant today, Mary L. Duziak, who is the Asa Griggs Candler Professor of Law at Emory University. She is a leading scholar of legal history and of the United States and the world. She's the author of many books, Wartime, An Idea, Its History and Consequences, published by Oxford in 2012, Exporting American Dreams, Thurgood Marshall's African Journey, Oxford 2008, and Cold War Civil Rights, Race and the Image of American Democracy from Princeton University Press, 2000. She's the editor of a number of volumes as well. She has published essays in Foreign Affairs, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other periodicals. She founded the Legal History blog. She contributes to Balkanization, was elected in 2017 to be president of the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations, and she serves on the Historical Advisory Committee of the US State Department. That's just the short version of the biography. But with that, I will turn it over to Mary. The Zoom room is yours.
Thank you, Eric, for that generous introduction. And I'd like to start by thanking the Wilson Center, both for hosting us today and giving us something to think about other than the life and death crises facing the world outside the Zoom room. But really, I have a personal thank you to the Wilson Center. I was awarded a Charlotte W. Newcomb Fellowship when I was a graduate student, and I literally don't know how the rest of my career would have proceeded without that necessary fellowship arriving at the right time. So thank you. And thank you to Mira for having written such a really wonderful book, giving us the reason to gather today. So let me say a word about why I love this book. A word about how I think of the book fitting into a broader literature. And then let me ask Mira a question about sort of method historiography, just to sort of get us going. So the book to me is like this beautiful puzzle. And it sort of starts, chapters and passages will start with a narrative and then just sort of pull you in to this elaborate puzzle of ideas that then take surprising and interesting turns and are consequential. And so she weaves together statelessness as a problem, especially after World War. I love the first three chapters, which then the rest of the book, of course, is wonderful too. But it's the puzzle nature of these first three chapters where we see statelessness as emerging as a huge problem after World War I, and how it intersected with international politics and the development of international law. And you might generally think about statelessness as the absence of something, statelessness as a loss. But I think this book shows that statelessness was essentially generative. Statelessness essentially does work in history. And that was what I persistently found so fascinating about the book. So she traces thinking about the way that the emergence of stateless populations then essentially shakes up how people think about sovereignty, rights, and international law itself in these sort of formative years, and then the story changes as time goes on. So traditionally, individuals' rights and status were derived from membership in a state. So when there were new populations of stateless people, essentially, did they exist in a way that law could recognize them? Would any court have jurisdiction over them? Would law protect them? How could courts essentially see them? The courts came to recognize the stateless as legally cognizable, as people that the law could see. And this then ends up basically motivating a departure from positivist ideas that legal status derived from the relationship with the state. Now, a reason that statelessness, as I understand the narrative, was generative was that it essentially required the creation of law to fit them during this period. So if rights did not derive from membership in a state, then where did it come from? Did it come from natural law? It basically opened the door to the need for international law. And then international lawyers and legal theorists will love this book because it's basically all about you. And it basically, shows the role of particular individuals. And, everyone's familiar with Arendt's role here, but one of the contributions of the book is that Mira essentially contextualizes, periodizes, and actually corrects Arendt. And so the really important passage about how Arendt sort of fits into the sort of longer history. So in terms of how this book, I was thinking about as I was reading, both about sort of core methodological questions, but also about how the book either intersected or doesn't, with sort of other literatures. And I, immediately thought before picking up the book, when I learned about it, about Linda Kerber's work, and you may well know her essays on statelessness, and she just gave an important lecture for the American Council of Learned Societies, and so that's been an intellectual project of hers. And I also thought about the sort of broader literature on migration and the great immigration histories that have been written in recent years, have been written for decades. So one classic way that historians will write about these topics is to tell sort of deep narratives about individual persons or groups, and either trace them across time or have a different story per chapter that raises a different element of a broader problem. And so these sort of deeply contextualized narratives that focus around the lives of particular individuals experiencing the problem in the book. And Mira's book is very much a history of ideas and a history of legal ideas. And so although there are stateless persons or people attempting to claim statelessness who figure in the narrative, the core characters are people thinking and using law. The legal idea, people formulating legal ideas, and the relationship between different schools of thought. And I think that the book is. This is the book's sort of enduring importance and value. And I think it will be a must read in legal history for a long time because of this. But it also basically opens it maintains the room for, like the rest of you out there, all of your books, right? Because Mira essentially provides the sort of the scaffolding of a particular set of ideas that then other historians are able to engage in their more the sort of social history and other sort of more ground up, for example, histories of migration, refugees, statelessness, etc. So I think that there's lots of room for books on statelessness. Mira has carved out a particular crucial part of that story that is so intricate and complicated that we couldn't have seen it the way that we now can without Mira's really very careful history. So I think that the book is really sort of brilliant and wonderful and enables the rest of the field rather than sort of capturing it. So that is also, I think, one of the reasons the book will be of enduring importance. So let me ask a question about sort of method in historiography. And I think the book, sort of running through the book, is basically a strong argument that ideas are a force in history, that ideas actually do stuff in history, that ideas are consequential, they are causal. So ideas as a causal force in history, at least at times. So at least in those first three chapters, then the Kelson chapter, maybe not. Instead, it's sort of a stepping back, and the legal theorists are arguing with each other. And then the power of the emergence of statelessness as a concept and the stepping back from the primacy of the state, that then gets eclipsed, it seems, in the post-World War II years. But what eclipses it is ideas, right? And so I wonder whether you see the book that way, as basically making a claim that, I mean, you don't argue that other causal forces don't matter, but at least in parts of the book, the certain things wouldn't happen without the ideas. I think that's the claim. And so that's and so is it the case that we want to look at ideas as a causal force as opposed to ideas as a justification for things that happen because of other causalities? And then can you say something about the sort of the periodization of ideas about rights inhering in the individual, right, as opposed to rights deriving from the state, and how that and just sort of trace how that thread changes over time. So.
Can I respond?
You
Yeah.
absolutely
Oh,
may.
great. Okay. Well, I mean, first of all, thank you so much, Mary, for taking the time to engage with the book. I really could not have dreamed up a better panelist, interlocutor. So that's maybe I owe the Wilson Center and Eric and Christian for this opportunity. So I'm very grateful for that. I mean, just in terms of the landscape that you kind of situate the book in, which I think is extraordinarily clarifying and helpful, because I was coming out, from a slightly different direction. I ended up reading a lot of histories of migration, but I started out kind of coming from history of political thought and international law. So I think some of what you describe is a result of encountering that literature in a kind of unexpected way, not coming from that place originally. But of course, I mean, I'm completely in debt to all the new writing on the history of migration and migration control, and Linda Kerber's work on statelessness. So yes, I'm I'm very much hoping that the book is in dialogue with and a contribution to that broader field, and then introducing some other literatures that I think should be in conversation with those political and social histories. I mean, one of the things I kind of continually worried about was the fact that this is, I mean, an ethically important and fraught subject, and yet I wasn't handling it in a way that that focused on the experience of particular people, because I was interested in this level of debate about how to conceptualize a problem. You know, what does it mean in terms of how we organize ourselves politically? And so that kind of meant abandoning some of those methods and some of those focuses, although I do think the particular and the personal does come in, because, I mean, to connect to your question about methodology, because I don't think I could have written the book without the archive. I mean, just as a kind of history of texts and ideas. So that kind of takes me to this question about the role of ideas and kind of ideas in history. And there are points where I make, I think, rather strong claims that, you know, my impulse is always to qualify, but then I have to stop and say, no, if I really believe this, I have to say it, that it's important to understand how actors were explaining what they were doing. And whether we want to define that as, you know, justification, it ends up being embedded in the documents and the legal writing and the court cases and the international declarations and conventions as they're produced. So, I mean, I'm borrowing from legal historians and critical legal scholars who kind of bring the history of ideas together with kind of practical power, questions of kind of power and effect in the world, by looking at how ideas, arguments, and justifications find their way into legal documents that then have an effect on the world. So it becomes very difficult to parse, you know, is this just merely justification, when that justification ends up becoming the foundation for a legal source that then has particular effects and you know, force in the world. So, for example, the conventions on statelessness, I mean, there are many ways of thinking about the origins of those conventions. And I do look at the diplomatic history, the different kind of claims that are brought by different national representatives. But at the same time, they're all arguing, you do kind of discern a terrain of argument about the political and moral questions that are at stake in this problem of statelessness. And in the process, certain ways of thinking about the problem are then elided. But then those understandings then become encoded and embedded in the conventions, which then become the material, the raw material that lawyers and states use to make sense of the world and to label people, in some cases to accord rights to certain people, in other cases to evade responsibility. So in order to make sense of the material that, you know, I think less controversially has an effect on the real world, my argument is that we can't understand what those text documents, institutions were meant to do unless we set them in an ecology of argument and debate. And then that in turn requires a much deeper investigation into the nature of the ideas themselves. So it's not, you know, I'm not going to stand up and give a kind of Protestant ethic in the spirit of capitalism explanation about the role of ideas in history. But I mean, certainly I think that law and legal history provides a particular opportunity to show the intersection between ideas and practice. In terms of periodization, so I mean, if we just step back and think about the kind of more, I suppose, I don't know how conventional it is at this point, because the history of human rights and the historiography is kind of expansive at this point. But I mean, the idea that individuals don't become in more technical terms, the subjects of international law, and that they don't bear human rights, even absent citizenship, that this is a development of the post-World War II period, I think for a long time was a kind of central feature of how we understand the history of rights and the history of an international history. And so one of the kind of twists that I'm trying to show is that, I mean, yes, the concept of human rights is declared and codified in certain ways after World War II. But if we actually look at the texts that discuss the problem of statelessness beginning after World War I, the idea that it's individuals who are either the bearer of rights in the absence of a national status or the subjects of international law assumes a much more kind of intensive and animated form in the interwar era. And a lot of those debates drop away. I mean, they disappear. The question of legal personhood and legal personality, which is just, everywhere in the interwar period. It's why I spent a lot of time in the Kelsen chapter talking about people like Friedrich Maitland and Otto Gierke, because this kind of legal consciousness around the notion of what it means to have legal agency was central to this conception of what it might mean to be the bearer of rights in the absence of state recognition. And the fact that a lot of those discussions really disappear after World War II raises new questions about what human rights and what it meant to kind of claim rights beyond the state after World War II meant. And so that's one periodization that I'm trying to track. In a much longer intellectual history, though, there is a kind of long-standing conception of the possibility of the stateless person. And I kind of mark it in the 18th century, but there are some ways you could kind of take it back to Roman law, that the possibility that the person without a national status represents this possibility of kind of natural rights, or kind of what it means to have natural rights in the absence of kind of political protection. And that comes up in discussions in the later 19th century and the 20th century too. And it partly explains why the emergence of statelessness as this kind of acknowledged political problem becomes this test case for these long-standing ways of thinking about the questions of rights and law, and they become this kind of site of at least intellectual experimentation. So there's much more to say, but I want to keep talking and hearing. So,
so thank you. So if I was teaching a legal history grad seminar, mm-hmm. I would assign your book together with May Night and Possible Subjects. I mean, mm-hmm. really sort of back on the same theme. I mean, how do we think about what's doing the work in history? And so, Nye writes about the, how it is that the, quote unquote, illegal alien comes to exist. How is that idea produced? And the production of that idea, I mean, it's in some ways it has a parallel with statelessness, right? Sort of both are kind of impossible, but then they come to be either seen or not seen in law, and then that has consequences. So in Nye's work, it's it's essentially that there's a labor, pre-existing set of labor relations, and there is movement across the border, which is then interfered with when the border becomes more subject to control. And so then labor needs and the sort of long history of labor migration, which had been just part of the landscape, ends up resulting. So it's sort of what's driving the production of the legal category, and then the consequences of that are it's labor, it's social groups, it's growers in California and the West. So it's agriculture, it's xenophobia, it's it's the way that racism allows certain laborers to be seen as an other. And then, all sorts of particular things that happen over time. But so it's more kind of socially produced. And that then results in an idea, the illegal alien, which then, as law, has just terrible consequences. In terms of your book, I guess I most wondered about the post-World War II years. And there seemed to be something going on with regard to, countries not wanting to recognize refugees. And we might think of that sort of, back to, concerns about, not wanting to accept populations that don't look like us. But more broadly, there we would, why wouldn't we think of law as being in some ways more kind of sidelined to geopolitics, to the Cold War, and to so is the Cold War period for migration and statelessness, more like this sort of closing down of the fluid labor migration in the Southwest. So the Cold War is, the geopolitics sort of taking over in a way that ideas can't play a role. In your work, ideas can't play the kind of role that they played in earlier years, so that the periodization would be from a powerful role for ideas to that sort of dissipating, at least during the Cold War.
I mean, I see how and certainly in the way that I've written it, in the second half of the book. Can I jump in, or? Yeah.
Absolutely.
The way that I've written it, the kind of wrangling over definitions. How expansive should we define this category of the stateless person in contrast to the refugee? I'm kind of trying to capture the politics in a way that the politics were slightly less visible, I think, in the first half of the book, when I'm, exactly as you said in such a great way, that it's like setting up the puzzle. And then it feels maybe a little bit like the real world comes in a little bit more in the second half, when some of the more familiar markers of geopolitics come into the story a bit more. But I'm not sure that we can trace that trajectory from like an arena where ideas have a little bit more salience or kind of free-flowing power, which I think is one way kind of traditionally of thinking about the contrast between the League of Nations and the United Nations, that the League of Nations was a little bit more of a dream factory and was this stage upon which various kinds of international theorists and thinkers and dreamers could project visions of international order. And after World War II, the UN becomes this much more realpolitik institution, which it is in some ways, because it's trying to correct perceived errors in the past. It's giving a much more powerful role to the great powers. It's kind of set up institutionally to look like that. But I think I'm trying to show that the arguments about how to define statelessness, its significance, continue to matter quite a lot in the wranglings over definitions, over the conventions. And one of the reasons is that nationality, if we think about the history of nationality in terms of the history of border control and immigration, you tend to think about it in terms of the history of already bordered countries or countries that are trying to establish or kind of make their boundaries even more firm. But nationality is an international concept. It already has entailments about how one sovereign place relates to another sovereign place, how one country defines its nationals has implications for how that other country recognizes the status of their nationals. It's already an international concept which comes with implications about how we comprehend interstate, interpolitical, international order, however we want to call it. And so I think those debates absolutely continue after World War II. And that one of the interesting things is how the UN or the UN context is so successful in kind of quieting down what is still an ultimately destabilizing issue. How do you kind of define boundaries and kind of make and settle these very contentious questions when there are millions of people that are still moving in and out of them, when the nature of those kind of the citizenry is just being defined? These are automatically unsettled issues that become increasingly unsettled over the course of the Cold War and decolonization. But the UN and international law has contributed to ways of kind of stabilizing these intrinsically destabilizing questions. And one of the ways it does this is in the way that the concept of the refugee is defined as against the concept of the stateless person, and how ideas about nationality being bound up with something that is already socially constituted and real, being this kind of critical justificatory language to close off these questions that did come up in the interwar period about how law and legal analysis and kind of the imagination of lawyers does actually constitute political reality in many circumstances. But that fact gets shut down in a variety of ways in the post-war era. And I think it allows us to understand the dynamics of what's actually happening in the debates of the post-war period. So even there, I think it's not that ideas don't have a platform anymore, but that the ideas change, the arguments change. They become much more about the morality of statelessness, and so that's the shift that I was trying to make sense of.
So let me just ask one more question, and that we've got a lot of other folks who I'm sure are going to want to weigh in. But one thing I was thinking about as I was reading your book is actually about the ocean, and the ocean basically figures in the book sort of as a bad place, right? It's where the man without a country is sailing the world, and then you sort of mentioned it briefly in the conclusion about statelessness being produced by climate change and island nations being overwhelmed. The Pacific world literature, you get a very different sense of the oceans, and there the ocean is a social and political space. It's a place of commerce. It's really a vibrant locale of history, so that history happens on the oceans and in the oceans. And we might think of, well, but there's not sort of sovereignty over the oceans. And what you see, at least American military planners thought of the Pacific as an American lake after World War II. And had, I would say, looking at the Pacific as an empty space for use, like for Pacific testing, exercised forms of sovereign power over the parts of the Pacific. So the ocean is actually a really important locale in history, isn't always the focus of our work. And I just wonder whether there's more to say about statelessness and the ocean, as opposed to just the ocean as a place of, loss.
That's so interesting. And it kind of takes things in a totally different direction. I mean, the ocean comes up in the book, but you're absolutely right that it comes up as it's figured in the source material that I'm looking at, which is as a lawless place. And the fact that a stateless person can only find a home in the ocean is a kind of indication of the lawlessness of the state of statelessness. So that's the formulation. And it's important from the perspective of how these theorists and writers of international legal treatises are constructing, what the imaginary legal space or the non-legal space of the ocean. And then you get Lasse Oppenheim's, famous treatise where he's saying, well, if you have a flag, then you're kind of carrying your sovereignty with you. But if you don't have a flag, then it's just this kind of lawless nothing. And that's what it means to be a stateless person. But then you have this totally different literature, which says, that's of course not true. There's a lot of social life and political life, and there's enclaves, and there's, the ocean has these different lanes of kind of legal ordering that Western international legal theory and state theory was deliberately blind to. And in some ways it was kind of constructed against that reality. So because I'm focusing on those discourses, it's true that the kind of the political and legal and social histories that you're talking about get kind of effaced. And it also means that the problem of, or the condition of those whose countries are increasingly underwater, has been kind of framed in international legal terms in a particular way. It's a problem of the loss of territory, therefore meaning the loss of sovereignty. That's one tradition, that's one way of thinking about the problem. But of course, it's so important, you're identifying that there is all this literature that kind of allows us to think about the problem in a totally different way. And that in fact, there were these other ways of constructing the legal and political meaning of the oceans that also carries implications for the meaning of statelessness, because they kind of were twinned. So yeah, just thank you for that.
Well, thanks very much. We're now going to go to the broader question and answer part of this webinar. Any number of you have already found your way into the Q&A function. So please continue to do so. You could also use the raise hand function in Zoom. Those of you who have written questions, if you'd like to speak them yourself rather than have me do it, you can raise your hand and I can call on you. Let me start off moving from the realm of legal theory to narrative. And if you could just say a bit more about what it means concretely for individuals to be stateless. You have kind of a wonderful example from an Eric Ambler novel, Epitaph for a Spy from 1938, a detective novel, in which his protagonist describes what it is for him to be stateless. If you could just kind of give us a broader description. If you were an individual in 1920 or 1938, what does it mean in terms of your life, what you can do and cannot do to be stateless?
Okay, well, thank you for that. That's a key point, because I do tend to kind of drift off into the realm of the abstract. So it's good to kind of be brought down to earth. So the Ambler novel, it's this wonderful, it's still a super engaging story, but it features, I talk about it at the beginning of the 4th chapter, this great character who's from the former Habsburg Empire. He doesn't have a nationality, and he's very eloquently describing that he is an impossibility. That to kind of go back to Menai's phrase, he's an impossible person. He cannot exist anywhere. And therefore there is no choice for him other than to destroy himself. And that question of kind of suicide comes up quite a bit in a lot of the letters and the petitions that I found of people who are writing to the League of Nations and other international organizations describing their predicament. From the period immediately after the First World War onwards, where they're describing themselves as saying, well, I'm not identified. I used to live in Vienna, but now I'm somewhere else, or I'm not being identified as a state, as a national. Can you please help me? Can you give me a passport? And so the real predicament shadows the book. That there is this kind of inherent tragedy to the story, which is that the vast majority of people that were defining themselves as stateless, or in some particular cases were kind of given this status by the League of Nations in the interwar period, were facing, dire circumstances, and that varies, and it depends on the period. 1925 is different from 1938. Depending where you are, your circumstance might be different. I mean, are you a Russian refugee living in Paris in 1925? It depends on your circumstance, but the question of how to cross a border, how to get a job, it's all intrinsically connected to the need to have some kind of identification that allows you to cross a border, and in many cases to get a job, which is how you can sustain yourself in a period of kind of economic deprivation generally. So there's a lot of catastrophic circumstances. On the other hand, the book starts by talking about a figure named Max Stoke, who was the first person to be kind of defined as a stateless person in legal terms in a British court. And he does face severe deprivation. He's defined as an enemy alien during World War I because he was a kind of he had a status as a German national. But his story kind of complicates our picture of the problem of statelessness, because he's also a kind of economic actor who's not particularly invested in being defined as a particular nationality. He just faces the bureaucratic plight of being defined as an enemy national, and as a result faces a lot of difficult circumstances. But when he ends up being defined as a stateless person, he kind of ends up resuming his life as it was before. It's kind of a more ordinary story, and he ends up returning to Germany and kind of returning to his existence. So it's the fact that the problem of statelessness is not only conceptualized in humanitarian terms, and the fact that the question of kind of the humanitarian in contrast to the legal and the political shows up as kind of explicit terms of debate and argument in the interwar period, that I found really surprising when I encountered the material. So we're used to thinking about, if you're stateless in Poland in 1938, you're facing, death, essentially. If you don't get some kind of visa that can get you to Shanghai or somewhere else, you're facing the most dire circumstances. We know this. And I certainly didn't want to marginalize that feature of the phenomenon. On the other hand, the implication of statelessness wasn't only about this kind of extreme vulnerability. And I thought that it was also necessary to explain something about that to tell this kind of bigger legal and intellectual history. So yeah, so I don't know if that answers the question exactly, but it varied. It was mostly bad, but the complexity matters.
Thank you. We've got a good number of questions. I'm going to weave one of them and amplify it with one more of my own. You write about institutions as well as legal theorists, and the League of Nations is one of those institutions. There are two groups that stand out in the first part of the book for how they are treated, Russians and Armenians. And there's this phenomenon of the Nansen passport, which is a mechanism by which these particular stateless people can be granted some rights. One of our listeners has written in to ask about the Nansen passports. Why did they fail? So if you could just talk a little bit about the Russians and the Armenians, the League of Nations, the Nansen passport, and its fate.
Okay. Well, thank you for that question. I'm thinking about the concept of failure, because it's like, how do you qualify failure? So the broader context is that there is an innovative kind of passport that's developed by the League of Nations. A polar explorer named Fridtjof Nansen is put in charge of this program to give some kind of international identification to certain designated populations. And one of the tensions that emerges is that there are many people who would like to obtain what comes to be called the Nansen passport, which is it's a document that identifies you as a stateless person, and it indicates that the High Commission for Refugees, which is one of these new international institutions, can validate your identity. It serves as a kind of consular authority, although the nature of that authority is precisely what has to be kind of battled and worked out. You know, who's going to accept it? Are any state or border officials going to accept this passport? Will they let you actually pass? So it is very innovative, and it's a big point of contention as to who will get it, because initially it's given only to those who had left the former Russian Empire, left during the Russian Revolution, and then it's extended to Armenians who had also fled. So why does it fail? I mean, there's a lot of discontent for those who don't get the passport, first of all, who don't get to be identified as Nansen refugees, because at least theoretically, it comes with a kind of a source of protection. I mean, even if it doesn't always work in practice. On the other hand, for those who carry the Nansen passport, they often write about how frustrating it is, how limited it is, how much they wish that it represented a more potent and powerful form of political and legal identification. It doesn't mean really that you have, you know, citizenship of the world or some citizenship of a kind of supranational state. It's a bureaucratic tool that sometimes allows you to cross a border and sometimes doesn't, and often doesn't allow you to find work, which was, you know, really front and center the main issue for many of the refugees. So there's I think I quote in the book, Nabokov, who writes about the Nansen passport as this just kind of miserable bureaucratic document. But in part because it really represents the plight of being stateless, the fact that the Nansen passport doesn't give you the kind of protection and rights that can come from being a national citizen. On the other hand, there's a lot of envy and controversy in the interwar period, because it has this symbolic and representative status, maybe not of a kind of international reality as it is in that moment, but as it could be, or as it's kind of the possibility of things evolving in a much more expansive direction, where it is possible to claim a non-state identification. And the Nansen passport is really bound up with that. But the Nansen Pass continues to be an important international tool, and it's expanded eventually in the 1930s to encompass many of the German and Austrian Jewish refugees. Hannah Arendt got to the US using a Nansen passport. In the course of writing this book, I can't tell you how many people have told me, oh, I have my parents' or my grandparents' Nansen passport, which I love. So it served an incredibly important function for a period. It has a very important symbolic function, but it was extremely limited in many ways.
Thank you. I'm going to combine two questions that we've received, one via email, one via the Q&A. Jeremy Popkin asks, this seems like an essentially Eurocentric discussion focused on the 20th century. What about the status of enslaved Africans, Native Americans in the period of US expansion, and other populations who were not recognized as belonging to states in earlier centuries? And from email, Anan Yang writes, were there any statelessness-like notions pre-20th century? What happened to people who attempted to cross national borders in the 19th century, for instance, whose citizenship had been revoked, or others who were sent into exile? What papers did they carry? I ask as someone who was stateless for many years because I didn't qualify for citizenship in the country of my birth.
So these are both really important questions. So thank you. So the book is, I mean, I started my kind of overview of the book saying, you know, the title is kind of, you know, I will say that it wasn't the title I picked, but I'm very, very happy with it. It's very expansive and big. And I hope it draws people with different interests and questions in. But then it is framed in a very particular way. It's framed around the question of, well, how do we explain how these codified legal frameworks, the definitions that we now have, you know, that define what it means to be a refugee or stateless person. How do we explain that history? How do we tell that story? And so it's necessarily circumscribed and limited to explicit discussions on the meaning of statelessness by people who eventually contribute in one way or another to the creation of those conventions, or to kind of a broader intellectual and political context in which those conventions were codified. And famously, the Refugee Convention and the Statelessness Convention, I mean, one of the big questions that emerges now about how to think about the legacy of the post-World War II order is, what do we do about the mechanisms and institutions that were created in that period? I mean, do they still fit our current reality? Do they still make sense? I mean, they were constituted at very particular moments, at a very particular histories, and they deliberately excluded non-European stateless people in many ways. They were focused on the European refugee crisis. That was the immediate context of their formation. And their kind of constraints kind of came out of that particular context. So I also didn't want to apply my own definition of statelessness to kind of encompass, what is the history of statelessness, and then to kind of develop my own definition to then apply to writing the history. So I was looking at people who were writing and debating in a very particular time and place and making sense of this concept. So that, I hope, explains something about how I kind of carved up the research and how I ended up writing it. But your question is really, really important, because the idea that that enslaved people and indigenous people and imperial and those who are kind of subject to empire, that they're not citizens, and that they are often described as in 19th century terms as nationals but not citizens. So they kind of belong to particular state or imperial powers, but are not they don't belong in a substantive sense, was critical to the kind of international legal debates and discourse that I'm trying to write about. So the book talks about how the status of Native Americans, for example, and the status of the subjects of American empire, that they were defined in some ways in the 19th century against the problem of statelessness, saying because statelessness cannot be, it's not a reality, indigenous people are nationals without having citizenship status, or imperial subjects are nationals without having citizenship status. So if we focus on European discourses of international law and national law, then the figures that you talk about do come into the story, but not in the sense of kind of, but in a very particular way. In terms of kind of enslavement, the status of slaves in Roman law comes up quite a lot in the writing, right? Because in Roman law, the question of kind of slavery as a kind of social and civil death comes up in terms of thinking about what is a stateless person? Are they kind of civilly dead? So those histories exist, and they're in the background of how the problem of statelessness is conceptualized in a European and a transatlantic context. But it's true that the book it's not a global history of everyone that could be included in a history of statelessness written in a very different way. So and then kind of shifting to the other question about pre-20th century migration, I mean, that kind of takes us into the literature on migration that Mary was talking about earlier. So there's kind of a simplistic and not really correct story about how movement in general was just a lot easier before the 20th century, and that World War I marks this kind of clear dividing line between an era when it was a lot easier to travel without a passport or without kind of identifying documents, and World War I being this kind of clear stopping point. There's migration control beginning in the mid 19th century, in the later 19th century. There are a lot of really important histories written about this subject, and there are differences though, because it's the question of kind of how much who you are makes a difference as to how much identifying documentation you need to have. wealthier people could get away to some extent with not having a clear national identification. At the same time, yeah, I mean, your power as a Western subject comes from your connection to your home country. So yeah, these are important questions, but there is a kind of huge history of migration in the 19th century and identifying documents, and there's a lot of great material on that subject. And the answer is that things do become more restrictive as you move closer to the 20th century, but it's quite complicated. Yeah.
Thank you. From Ikta Talwar, we have a question. The notion of ideas historically as they apply to peoples going from states to other states have also applied to settlers, Jews, escaping pogroms, explorers, colonials, and Palestinians even now. What do you think about the evolution of such categories and how they impacted the treatment of the people received?
So I think if I understood the question correctly, it's that there is, so if we think about recent debates about how people are defined, are they, economic migrants, refugees? One of my interests in the subject is that how you're designated seems to matter quite a lot. And that if we kind of don't take, if we take the conventions as not that historically significant, not that many states have signed on to them, they're kind of marginal, they're just part of the universe of kind of human rights aspirations from the post-World War II period that haven't really had much of a bearing on international politics. I think we're seeing now in all kinds of ways that it's clearly pivotal how these definitions are applied or evaded. And there's a lot of debate about, the problem of those kinds of categorizations and how they end up, how they work in the way that states can kind of evade responsibility. So the first thing I would say is just that, yes, the categories matter a lot. You'd have to do a much bigger history of, thinking about the many categories that were introduced in your question, some of which are the way that historians describe people who move, and some of which relate to kind of more legal bureaucratic categories that were applied in history to the people themselves. I think there's a lot of good political and social history to be done to show, going back to what Mary said about different kind of methodological approaches, to show the ways the rubber hit the road, how people could use categories in flexible and imaginative ways, how they could evade how they're being labeled and defined. And I'm sure there are many examples of those possibilities. On the other hand, I think the way international institutions and states frame how they label populations does have an effect on the real world. And it has effect on how institutions and bureaucrats and officials, how they justify their policies and their actions. And so they always matter. But how they matter is up to kind of the historian and the sociologist and the political scientist to study how that actually works on the ground.
Thank you. From Jim Banner, we have a question, an institutional question, he says, one of practice. If one is stateless, how does that person go about try to become stated? Through what institutions, by virtue of what legal processes and what legal venues, by appealing perhaps more than one at the same time, to what authorities, and so forth?
Good question. Well, when they, going back to the early 50s and to the conventions again, one of the proposals was that alongside or as part of the convention, there should be a distinct institution that's established to adjudicate the situation of stateless people, meaning a stateless person could actually go before an institution and kind of explain their life story, their status, bring their documents, and that this institution would be, at least theoretically, given the authority to kind of adjudicate these issues. And that was one of the things that got written out. That was not acceptable to most of the countries that were involved in the formation of the convention. To a more limited extent, the High Commissioner for Refugees has taken on a lot of the responsibility for those people who are legally defined as stateless around the world. So one point of kind of appeal would be the UNHCR, but the other place to appeal would be the government to which you are trying to belong to, and so those politics are going to vary quite a lot depending on where in the world the statelessness issue is. So there has been a campaign developed by the UNHCR for a while now to get more countries to sign on to the Statelessness Convention, to identify populations of people, individuals that don't have citizenship, and to get states to just comply with either the international agreements or just to kind of acknowledge the problem of statelessness and to enfranchise those people. And in some cases that's been successful, but again, that varies from place to place. But as a kind of international institution, it is the UNHCR that carries the central responsibility for stateless people around the world, at least theoretically.
Thank you. Laura Robson asks, I wonder if you could comment on the relationship of the Palestinian refugee, quote unquote, who is functionally stateless but falls under a distinct international legal categorization, with these other exemplars of statelessness and the conversation around them in the decades after 1945. What does the existence of this separate legal category of statelessness for Palestinians indicate about the nature of the system being erected with the UN Convention of 51 and its expansion to apply to refugees outside of Europe in 1967? Why do you think Palestine has continued to be considered a distinct legal case, not incorporated into the international system to deal with refugees or with statelessness for so long?
That's a really important question. And it actually, in some ways, it kind of answers itself, because it highlights the fact that one of the things about the post-war international politics that we need to pay attention to is how these explosive and contentious political questions get managed and neutralized via these different ways of categorizing different peoples who are all subject in some ways to the kind of explosive dynamics of state making, which then produces new forms of exclusion. These are inherently political and destabilizing issues. And yet the way within the confines of the United Nations, the problem gets kind of carved up and separated out. Stateless people are a different question from refugees, right? To be a refugee is to be persecuted. That's part of the definition. To be a stateless person is to legally be without a nationality. And because the legal problem of not having a nationality suddenly came to seem kind of obscure relative to the mass crisis of displacement in the post-war era, legal nationality just seemed like less of a moral problem for the world to focus on. And then in the case of Palestinian refugees, there's an entirely different agency that's established to provide legal identification and to be a kind of permanent post to address the problem, which indicates how at the level of the international, these destabilizing questions about who gets to have a state, what is citizenship, how are the boundaries defined, get kind of carved up and as a result kind of neutralized and bracketed. And so I think that the very fact that that state officials and international officials ended up with these kinds of solutions, insofar as they are solutions, to introduce new forms of identification and categorization, these were administrative mechanisms that ultimately serve to kind of break up the ultimately kind of destabilizing issues that really threaten the possibility of establishing any kind of post-war order. So I mean, this is in the context where many countries are suddenly assuming new national statehood. So I think that's how I would think about that question, which already points to the legacies of the post-war period, right? That the way these categories get carved up continue to have implications for the people who continue to be subject to the regimes that were established at that time. there are, I mean, many other political factors that go into the construction of that particular political problem. But I think one of them is precisely what you say, how Palestinians get defined as a separate issue, a separate problem from the broader from the European refugee crisis, or even from the legal status of stateless persons. So thanks.
Sarong S. asks, thanks for a great talk. You speak of a before when rights and membership of a society were entirely tied to the state. Yet there was a before to the before modern states were formed, a time of highly decentralized polities when citizenship or membership was primarily local and not in fact tied to a state of which the local community was nominally a part of. Have you considered engaging with this sort of idea of citizenship, and how such understandings, till recently still alive in the global South, may illuminate where we're headed in the future, in which global migration accelerates and nation states potentially weaken?
That's a great question, especially because it's that fact that citizenship was not comprehended only in terms of national citizenship that is the kind of key context for the way that I write the story. I mean, so the idea that everyone must have citizenship in a state and it has to look a certain way and it's defined internationally in a certain way, it's against the background of the recognition of these many other ways of conceptualizing political identification that it gives further urgency to explain how it happened, when it happened, and the way that it happened. So it's kind of the kind of broader context that you point to clarifies the periodization of my own work. And so when I say before, I mean that you're right. It's quite kind of ambiguous from the perspective of kind of how the periodization that we're actually talking about. It's the fact that in the international legal writing that I'm talking about in the late 18th and 19th century, which is asserting against a much more complicated reality, asserting that everyone must have, a national status in a country, that is not reflective of reality on the ground. It's not reflective of how people identify. It's not reflective of the complicated nature of imperial and inter-imperial order. It's not reflective necessarily of the nature of identification in the late 18th century United States or the 19th century United States, but it does tell us something about the way political writers and theorists were proposing and presenting a particular vision of the world, a vision of the world that ultimately bears out in reality in some way. So it's, I mean, in the interwar period, for example, it's because the notion of kind of citizenship is open to different ways of thinking about kind of extraterritorial identification, to different ways of thinking about national identification in a federal context, that the stateless person also has this kind of generative, Mary used the term generative, it has this generative function precisely in a context where the expectation isn't that the future is necessarily going to look like everyone is a citizen in a national state in the way that it's kind of codified in 1945 in at the United Nations. So, and even through the early 1940s, the question of statelessness is really bound up with the future of world order, a future that for many people might look like some kind of supranational entity. It might look like a bunch of regional orders or federations. And so the question is, yes, of kind of recovering those different ways of ordering people and thinking about identification, but also trying to make sense of how those got kind of shut down and how to make sense of how those eventually got shut down, even though the contingency and the kind of brevity of that period of the national state does imply that, or at least some have suggested that it implies that we do need to look back to these other ways of thinking about citizenship and identification, and that it's not implausible to think about those forms of ordering in the future. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you. I unfortunately have to draw this to a close since our time is about up, but I want to thank Mira and Mary very, very much, as well as those of you who asked questions, and apologies to those of you whose questions we could not get to. And with that, I turn this back to Christian Osterman.
Thanks, Eric. Let me remind our audience that we will meet again next week, December 14, when we will have a chance to discuss Larry Wolf's new book on Woodrow Wilson and the reimagining of Eastern Europe. Thanks again to Mira, Mary, and Eric for a really terrific conversation. Thanks to all of you for watching and participating. We're adjourned. Stay safe and well. Take care.